There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. Vladimir Lenin said that. He could not have imagined the Middle East in the winter of 2026. He could not have imagined what a single Saturday morning would unravel, or perhaps more accurately, what decades of unraveling would finally come crashing down in a single Saturday morning. This is that story. To understand what happened on February 28, 2026, you have to go back, not just a few years, decades. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born in 1979 with a charter of grievances and a theology of resistance. From its very first days, the new regime identified two enemies above all others: the United States, which it called the Great Satan, and Israel, which it refused to recognize as a legitimate state, calling it an illegitimate Zionist entity occupying Palestinian land. For nearly half a century, that hostility simmered. Iran funded proxy armies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq. It built missiles, it enriched uranium, it played a long game, threading the needle between provocation and outright war, always pushing, always testing, never quite crossing the line that would invite annihilation. Then came October 7, 2023, and the line moved. When Hamas fighters broke through the border fence and massacred 1,200 Israelis in a single day, they lit a fuse that would take over 2 years to fully burn. Israel's response in Gaza was ferocious, sustained, and politically polarizing. But what mattered strategically, what changed everything, was what happened to Iran's network of allied forces in the months that followed. Israel didn't just fight Hamas, it systematically dismantled the axis of resistance. Hezbollah's leadership was decapitated in a series of precise Israeli strikes. The Assad regime in Syria, Iran's crucial land bridge to Lebanon, collapsed in December 2024. Hamas's top commanders were eliminated one by one. The proxies Iran had spent billions building and decades cultivating were broken, scattered, were dead. Iran was exposed, and it knew it. Underneath every dimension of this conflict lies a single terrifying question: will Iran get a nuclear bomb? Iran has pursued nuclear technology since at least 1957 and made the fateful decision to develop weapons capability during its war with Iraq in the late 1980s. For decades, the international community tried diplomacy. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, represented the most serious attempt to rein in Iran's ambitions. It worked, after a fashion. Most experts agreed it delayed Iran's nuclear breakout capability by at least a decade. Then, in 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the deal. By 2019, Iran began systematically violating it. By 2025, Iran had enriched uranium to levels dangerously close to weapons grade. The IAEA's own Director General warned in early 2026 that Iran's nuclear materials remained still there in large quantities despite previous strikes on its facilities. For Israel, this was existential, not a word Israeli officials use lightly. A nuclear Iran would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region forever. It would give Tehran a nuclear umbrella under which its proxies could operate with impunity. It would make every threat to wipe Israel off the map, rhetoric Iranian leaders had used for decades, something far more than rhetoric. Israel had been planning for years. The question was never whether, it was when and under what American administration. Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, and the strategic calculus shifted immediately. Trump reimposed maximum pressure sanctions on Iran. He authorized direct negotiations over the nuclear program, the first direct U.S.-Iran talks since 2018. But he also made clear his patience was finite. And crucially, he had a relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, that was closer than any in recent memory. Netanyahu had long been the loudest voice in any room arguing for military action against Iran. For years, American presidents had restrained him. Now the restraints were loosening.
The first open war between Iran and Israel came in June 2025. Israel launched major airstrikes on Iranian nuclear and military facilities on June 13th. Iran responded within hours, firing waves of ballistic missiles and drones toward Israeli cities. For 12 days, the region held its breath. The human cost was real, but by the standards of what would come, relatively contained. Iran claimed at least 610 of its citizens were killed. Israel reported 28 dead on its side, among them 4 women in an Arab town in northern Israel, a Ukrainian family that had traveled there seeking cancer treatment for their daughter, and an activist killed at home in Beersheba. Homes were destroyed, flights were grounded, schools fell silent. On June 18th, President Trump told reporters he was sending mixed signals deliberately. "Nobody knows what I'm going to do," he said. 3 days later, he answered the question. On June 21st, the United States joined the fight, striking 3 sites associated with Iran's nuclear program: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. The deeply buried facilities, hardened against conventional weapons, were seen by analysts as essentially unreachable without American bunker-buster munitions. Iran's Supreme National Security Council declared victory anyway. Trump announced a ceasefire on June 23rd via social media. Israel took many hours to confirm it had agreed to one. It was a messy, ambiguous end to a brief, brutal war. The aftermath was equally messy. Iran's nuclear program had been damaged but not destroyed. The IAEA later confirmed that most of Iran's enriched nuclear material survived. Iran's president Pezeshkian signed legislation halting cooperation with international nuclear inspectors. Iran arrested an estimated 21,000 people in connection with the war, and quietly, relentlessly, Iran began rebuilding, stockpiling missiles, enriching uranium, planning. The fuse had not been cut, it had merely been shortened. Between June 2025 and February 2026, there were talks, rounds of negotiations mediated by Oman, held in Geneva and elsewhere, attempting to find a diplomatic path through the nuclear crisis. Iran said it was willing to discuss limits on its program. The United States said it needed more. Israel watched the negotiations with barely concealed fury, convinced that Iran was using diplomacy as a stalling tactic, buying time to rebuild what had been bombed.
A senior Israeli defense official would later confirm to Reuters that the joint U.S.-Israeli military operation launched in February 2026 had been planned for months, with a specific date set weeks in advance. The negotiations, critics would later charge, were proceeding in parallel with preparations for war. Russia's Dmitry Medvedev accused Washington of using the nuclear talks as deliberate cover for military planning. The final round of talks in Geneva ended on February 26th, 2 days before the bombs fell, without a breakthrough. Saturday, February 28th, 2026. In the early hours of the morning, Israel and the United States launched what they called Operation Epic Fury, the most extensive military assault on Iran in history. This was not a repeat of June 2025. The scale was categorically different. The objectives were broader. Where June 2025 had targeted nuclear facilities, Operation Epic Fury targeted the entire apparatus of Iranian power: nuclear sites, missile manufacturing, the Iranian Navy, and the leadership of the Islamic Republic itself. Airspace across the region was shuttered. Within hours, Israeli missiles had struck sites in the heart of Tehran. The United States simultaneously hit military installations in Isfahan, Karaj, Kermanshah, Qom, and Tabriz. It was, as President Trump announced in a Truth Social post that morning, a major combat operation. Then came the news that few had expected to hear so quickly. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the 85-year-old cleric who had guided the Islamic Republic for over 30 decades, was dead, killed in an Israeli airstrike. His daughter and grandchild were reported killed alongside him. Iran's defense minister, the commander of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's army chief of staff, and the secretary of the Iranian Security Council were also killed in strikes targeting a meeting of Iran's Defense Council. In a single morning, Iran had been decapitated. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu released a video statement.
Our joint action will create the conditions for the brave Iranian people to take their destiny into their own hands. Trump posted that Khamenei could not avoid U.S. intelligence and surveillance and pledged that heavy and pinpoint bombing will continue uninterrupted throughout the week or as long as necessary to achieve our objective of peace throughout the Middle East and indeed the world. Iran's President Pezeshkian, now the most senior surviving official, called Khamenei's killing one of the gravest trials facing the Islamic world today and vowed that retaliation was a duty and a legitimate right. Iran's retaliation came fast and wide. The Revolutionary Guard announced it had launched attacks on 27 American military bases across the Middle East. Explosions were reported in Qatar. Missiles struck near facilities in Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Smoke rose over Doha. Air defense systems lit up across the Gulf. For the Gulf states, this was the nightmare scenario made real. These are countries that, in recent years, have quietly moved closer to Israel, normalizing relations, sharing intelligence, cooperating on air defenses. They host American installations not out of ideology, but out of pragmatic security calculation. They have also, for decades, been wary of Iran as a regional bully, funding Shia proxy groups, interfering in their internal affairs, threatening their energy infrastructure.
Now they were being punished for the crime of hosting American troops, for geography, essentially. Qatar, home to the massive Al Udeid Air Base. Bahrain, headquarters of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Kuwait, the UAE, all attacked. Saudi Arabia condemned Iran's strikes in what it called the strongest terms, warning of dire consequences. Qatar's foreign ministry released a statement noting, with barely contained fury, that events that began with Israel and the U.S. attacking Iran and continued with Iran targeting third countries are of a nature that risks the future of our region and global stability. The Gulf states were not neutral, but they had not chosen this war, and they were now bleeding for it anyway. For ordinary citizens in Doha, in Dubai, in Manama, Saturday morning brought something they had never experienced: the sound of incoming missiles, air raid alerts, hotels evacuating, airports closing. The abstract regional tensions they had lived with for decades had become terrifyingly, viscerally concrete. How did the United States get here? How did a president who ran explicitly on a platform of ending wars find himself launching a major combat operation against Iran, not once but twice in 8 months? The answer is partly Trump and partly the logic of American commitment in the Middle East, which has its own gravity regardless of who sits in the Oval Office. The United States has treaty obligations to Israel. It has military installations across the Gulf. It has spent decades declaring that it will not allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. Those declarations, made by administration after administration, are not infinitely deferrable. Trump, in announcing Operation Epic Fury, said the goal was to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime. He urged Iranians to use the moment as probably your only chance for generations to take control of their government. That framing, regime change wrapped in the language of liberation, is significant. Unlike the June 2025 strikes, which targeted nuclear facilities and military infrastructure, Operation Epic Fury is explicitly aimed at toppling the Islamic Republic. That is an enormous objective. It is, as CFR scholar Stephen Cook noted, an ambition that has rarely been achieved by bombing alone. The United States has a long and painful history of wishing adversarial regimes away through air power. But the domestic political calculus for Trump is straightforward. Netanyahu is an ally. Killing Khamenei is the kind of decisive, muscular action Trump's base celebrates. An election is approaching in Israel, and Netanyahu, whose political survival has for years depended on projecting strength, gains enormously from the partnership.
Levitt's confirmation that Trump monitored events overnight from Mar-a-Lago suggests a president engaged, not reluctant. House Democrats scrambled to convene an emergency caucus call. Congress was not consulted before the strikes. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres convened an emergency security session and warned that military action carries the risk of igniting a chain of events that no one can control.
Russia called the session. China expressed alarm. The world's multilateral institutions strained under the weight of a crisis moving faster than diplomacy could track. As of this writing, the outcome is unresolved. Iran's government has been shattered at its highest levels, but the Islamic Republic is not yet gone. The Revolutionary Guard has pledged revenge. Iran's missiles are still flying. The regime that killed tens of thousands of its own protesters just weeks ago, when a domestic reform movement briefly threatened its grip, is fighting for its institutional life. The question on every analyst's desk is whether bombing can accomplish what 47 years of sanctions, covert operations, assassinations, and negotiations could not: end the Islamic Republic. History suggests the answer is probably not by bombs alone. Regimes rarely collapse from the outside in. They collapse from the inside out when their own people decide the cost of submission exceeds the cost of resistance. Trump is betting that decapitating the leadership while urging the Iranian people to rise up will create the conditions for exactly that. It is an enormous gamble. Iran's population is young, educated, and has deep grievances with the clerical regime, but it has also been brutalized by decades of state violence. The same government that has arrested 21,000 people in connection with the 2025 war has not hesitated to kill tens of thousands of protesters in the weeks before Operation Epic Fury began. For Israel, the stakes are existential in the most literal sense. A nuclear-armed Iran has always represented the scenario Israeli defense planners dread above all others, not necessarily an Iranian first strike, but the strategic immunity a nuclear umbrella would provide to every proxy, every militia, every rocket aimed at Tel Aviv. That threat is now being confronted directly. Whether it is being eliminated is another question. For the Gulf states, the calculus is being rewritten in real time. They are under Iranian attack because they host American troops. They need those troops because Iran threatens them. They are now watching to see whether American power is sufficient to end that threat permanently, or whether they will be left, once the smoke clears, more exposed than before. For the world, the emergency sessions and the calls for restraint and the warnings about chain reactions all point to the same truth. No one outside the region controls what happens next. Not the UN, not the EU, not Russia or China, who gain from American overextension but have their own exposure to a destabilized Middle East. The oil markets are watching. The shipping lanes through the Gulf, through which a meaningful portion of global energy supply flows, are watching. There are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. The Middle East has known many such weeks: 1948, 1967, 1973, 1979, 2001, 2003, 2023. Each one rearranged the map of possibility. Each one created a new reality that the people who lived through it spent the rest of their lives navigating. February 28, 2026 is one of those weeks. The supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran is dead. American bombs are falling on Iranian soil. Iranian missiles are striking Gulf capitals that have been at peace for decades. The nuclear question, the question that has haunted international diplomacy for a generation, is being answered not by negotiators in Geneva, but by bunker-busting bombs dropped in the dead of night. Where it ends, no one knows. History rarely telegraphs its own conclusions. But one thing is certain: the Middle East that exists on the other side of this week will not look like the Middle East that existed before it. Decades happen, and then the world wakes up and has to figure out how to live in them.